All right. Simmer down, folks. Oh, that was quick. I was going to do the teacher thing where it's like, if you can hear me, clap once. All right, we're back. Hopefully you enjoyed the cookie cup or the espresso soda or two of them like I had and a Sour Patch Kid. Now, our final panel of the day. As we all know, technology has come to underpin nearly every aspect of our daily lives. As much as people argue whether technology is inherently good or inherently bad, people, institutions, and governance really play a huge role in tech's impact on all of us. Within Truman, we say a lot about what it would mean to approach the technology ecosystem from a values-based perspective, especially as technology becomes a focus of geopolitical jockeying. What does it mean to elevate democracy and to elevate human rights in this context? To continue this conversation, please welcome our panelists to the stage, along with our moderator, Kat Zakreski, a national technology policy reporter with the Washington Post.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. We have a wonderful panel today with representation from government, industry, civil society, starting out with Rose Jackson, the director of the Democracy and Technology Initiative at the Atlantic Council. We have Camille Stewart, the former Deputy National Cyber Director at the White House. And we have Sydney Olenek, the founder and CEO of Duke-O. Thank you all so much for being here today. And they are all Truman members. And so I think to kick this discussion off, we wanted to talk a little bit about how you ended up in the technology space, how your career took you there. Rose, do you want to start off with that?
Sure, thanks so much. And just to say, it's such a treat to get to do this with this community and with fellow Truman members that I have really had the pleasure of getting to know over too many years. I wouldn't like to admit how many years. I'm a democracy kid, so my entry point into tech really came through that vantage point. I spent time in domestic politics and with the National Democratic Institute in East and North Africa, and just happened to be overseas at the time that the Arab Spring kicked off. And so really kind of entered into the conversation looking at the ways that people were creatively leveraging technology for their own purposes, and often, in ways that I think the people that created that technology never imagined would happen. And then watching governments kind of catch up to it. So really entered that space with the viewpoint that tech was not really inherently good or bad in any one direction, so much as this increasingly important space that people were going to figure out how to use for their own purposes. And that took me on quite a journey through Libya during the revolution, working in Somalia at the time that people were quite online, Ugandan elections, into the United States government, where we were doing work with people trying to project internet freedom around the world and stay safe online, and ended up in Silicon Valley building a tech company when Donald Trump was elected, trying to help people connect to local action in the moment that it mattered the most. And kind of the sum total of those experiences really brought me to the central role that technology increasingly plays in whether we have human rights and democracy. Because we do everything at this point through tech in some form. You build a business, you talk to your families, you connect with your governments and their services, you exercise your rights and express your interest in democracy on these tech platforms. And so how they are funded, how they are governed, how they are built inherently shapes those interactions. And if we don't talk about that and have some sort of intentional grappling with what we want out of that, other people will. And that will shape our world and our interactions. And so I'm still a democracy and human rights person. It's why I started the program at the Atlantic Council that I have, because I really do think it's the forefront of competition for the question of human rights in the world.
And Camille, how about you?
My dad's a computer scientist.
That's a better answer.
And so I used to sit in the back of his computer science classes and play on his computer. And I learned BASIC really early, and he had me in Russian classes, and I was like groomed to work in tech. And then I decided to be a lawyer. And he was none too happy. But my career has been finding a way to blend the two passions. And so, worked on the Hill, went to law school, and found myself at a cybersecurity company after law school. And co-managing a SOC, leading their intellectual property related
What's a
online
SOC?
service. Security Operations Center. And doing their policy work, because what I came to realize in the midst of this social media boom is, as companies were trying to take down nefarious content, they really didn't understand the contours of the terms of services on these websites, of the law, and there was not a lot of policy or regulation or any guidance for these companies. And it became painfully clear that I could either be a compliance lawyer focused on breach notification, not as fun for me, or I could help them figure it out and figure out how we govern this technology that was clearly changing our lives, changing how we connected to all of these services. And so I went into the Obama administration and worked at the Department of Homeland Security, helped stand up the Cyber Infrastructure and Resilience Policy Office. And the trajectory has continued from there. I took that national security related focus and went to Google and built the election integrity program and the security policy program for the mobile business, and then I was the global head of product security strategy for all of the Alphabet products. And then I got this call. There were other things in there, Deloitte and research, and we'll talk about some of them. But then I got this call to go to the White House and lead the really exciting portfolio focused on emerging tech, supply chain security, human rights and technology, and then also cyber workforce. And so my path has been one of trying to figure out how we leverage technology to empower each of us. And I do mean each of us, like each and every one of us. And to do that, people need to understand how it's showing up in our lives. And we as the security practitioners, we as the national security practitioners or the cybersecurity practitioners need to understand how the context in which technology operates impacts how it is whether weaponized or leveraged for good.
And Sydney, you're here visiting from San Francisco. Tell us a little bit about your path there.
Thank you, Kat. And thank you, Rose, for organizing this panel and this discussion. She's been on us about this for months. And Camille, I just wanted to say, I recently read that what you do between ages of 9 and 15 really impacts what you do with your career. So the fact that you were sitting with your dad, who was a computer scientist, that really stuck out to me as special. I think it's also amazing to be here at the 20th anniversary of Truman. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sydney, and I actually worked at Truman as the membership director from 2010 to 2013. I think some OG person back there. I think I'm the only person that I'm aware of that has had the privilege of working for both founders of Truman. Rachel Kleinfeld, I worked for 3 years at Truman, and then I went to the Obama administration and got to work for Matt Spence as his chief of staff at the Pentagon for a couple of years. And I mention that because it's incredibly relevant sitting in this room, but also as this question about how did I get, what was my journey into where I am today. I think that both of those experiences and Matt and Rachel's mentorship and just everything I've learned from them, I think really set a strong values framework for me and how I think about the world and national security and everything like that. So really feel privileged to be on this stage today when I used to be the one who was planning the conference, and glad that this community is still so powerful. After I was in the Obama administration, worked at a couple startups, and my parents are both entrepreneurs. Back to the whatever you're doing when you're little. So I was used to sitting under their desks on the weekends and sweeping car wash parking lots and things like that, and I had the itch. So I decided to move to California because I wanted the influence of innovation, and I really wanted to learn how to build a company. And I really wanted to learn how to raise venture capital money and really just immerse myself. So moved out there for an education, frankly. And what I learned through that experience is the company that I built was really well suited to support technology companies. And so for the last 7 or 8 years, have been working to support those technology companies. And so we work with large gaming companies, AI companies, messaging companies. We work with most of the big tech companies, and we work with their security teams, intelligence, policy, and trust and safety teams. And my company, we have thousands of experts all over the world who are helping on democracy, human rights, security issues, and essentially what we do is a tech company will come to us with a problem that they're having, or because an election happened or there was a crisis, and we will pop up a team to help with that very specific problem. And so today we're, at this point, the company is paying millions of dollars to experts all over the world who are working on democracy, election, and those other issues to help support these companies on those initiatives. So that was my journey into technology.
And Sydney, on that point, it's such a critical year for elections around the world. What trends are you seeing out in the Bay Area when it comes to the company's policies this year?
I'm seeing, I'll talk a little bit about some of the elections and then just trends in general. Yeah, it's the biggest election year ever. I think that the last few election cycles, companies have learned a lot, and I think most of them are more prepared than they have been, even though you can't really prepare for this wave of AI and polarization and a lot of other things that we're dealing with. I think that, to be honest, I've personally been surprised that there haven't been more crazy headline stories with AI and elections and deepfakes, and I think that, it's early. And we got some interesting news here that's going to affect our election later this year, yesterday, as you guys know. So it's very TBD. But I think the mature companies, I think generally speaking, are more mature, and so I think that's one thing that we've been seeing. But I do think that there are a lot of risks around information integrity, obviously increasing, and a lot of companies have like one single policy that will apply globally, and so just trying to think through that and navigate what does that mean in that country. I think those are some of the things. The other couple of trends I just want to mention, from a Silicon Valley perspective in general, there are 3 that really stand out to me. One is just the speed at which these companies are moving, as you guys know, and in kind of like the experimentation that they're doing in these like early product releases. I think I've never seen competition among companies like this in my lifetime. And I think what really triggered that was when OpenAI launched ChatGPT, 20 months ago or something like that at this point. And we all talked about it with our friends and family over that winter break. And they sort of, released this product into the world that wasn't perfect. And all these other big tech companies have been working, obviously, on a lot of these AI products. And the permission set sort of shifted. And so now all of a sudden, these big tech companies are like, oh, we can start releasing products early too. And so before things have been perfect, and while products are flawed, what we're seeing now is just like rapid release of products. I think that if you're following any tech news, it feels like there's a new product release like at this point, like almost weekly, and you just can't keep up. And so the speed is really wild. And like the early product releases and things not being perfect it's really taking these companies back to kind of like their startup principles of like moving really, really quickly, which I think has been really interesting. The other one is just like the big bets and experimentation that these companies have to make to basically to be able to compete. And so even like semiconductors that some of these companies are purchasing, which they won't get for years, they're like, we don't even really know what we're going to do with those, but we're just going to put in that order, right? And so they're just placing massive bets. And then the third thing related to this is just, again, because the competition is fierce right now, there are also a lot of interesting partnerships in two ways. One, like among the different technology companies. And so, of course, you guys are probably familiar with like OpenAI and Microsoft, but this last week, there have been headlines about OpenAI and Apple. And so you are seeing that all of these companies are really competing on different products. We don't really know how this is gonna land. We don't really know how a lot of these AI products are gonna be monetized, but there are just partnerships within the industry that are really interesting with with their own competitors. And then there are a lot of partnerships internationally as well. And there have been a lot of partnerships in the Middle East, which we may end up talking about with Japan and other places, which we can get to. And so I think that just to kind of paint the picture of what we're seeing, everything's moving fast, a lot of big experiments, and a lot of big bets and partnerships. And I'll just close out by saying, I think the result is these companies are, I'm glad they're American, they're incredibly competitive right now, right? And so thankfully, the competition is really hot and it's on our soil, but it also means a lot more risk, and it also means a lot more, it means a lot more vulnerabilities, and it means that Washington has to move a lot faster and think a lot quicker than normal just to kind of keep up with this pace. And so I think it's up to this community in this room to kind of think through how do we keep up and mitigate risk.
Camille, on that point, as someone who's been in the White House for these situations, I mean, does this administration, does the federal government have the capacity to move as quickly as the tech is moving?
I mean, government never moves as quickly as the tech is moving. We should not, think that is what is going to happen. But what I am encouraged by is the close collaboration that we are building. Private sector is talking to government and vice versa. The collaboration on regulation, the collaboration on policy, the collaboration on risk mitigation and on reviewing incidents after they've happened, the collaboration on ideating about whether or not some of those product releases should even happen. I mean, I know you've seen some of the announcements from OpenAI again, but they've said, we got this new thing, but we're not going to give it to you because we feel like it might do more harm than good. And when has that happened, right? Like the thoughtfulness that is happening, I mean, they're still a private company, they still have a bottom line, they're still going to do what they need to do, but the fact that that is even a part of the dialogue means that we have made progress. The shift in government to create entities that allow for a continuous conversation, that collaboration, JCDC, OECD itself, I think is the kinds of moves that need to happen. And we need to continue to lean into how do we create those collaboration spaces and the opportunities for depth of understanding, particularly how companies are internalizing the evolution of the technologies that we are implementing. What we still need to do is build out a workforce that can do that, right, on both sides, and shift the market in a way that demands security and privacy first, right? You've heard a lot of conversations about security by design. That should not be lip service. What we need to do as a country, as a global society, is shift market incentives. So it's not first to market, let's move quickly and throw things out there, but how do we do that in a way that is secure and that considers privacy up front? And if we can make that shift, a lot of the slowness of government will be mitigated because we have changed how we are even innovating and ideating on the future of technology and how it underpins the things that we value and hold dear. And if we can do that work, I think we will have made a lot of progress. But there is a lot of work to do.
Can I build on something both of you raised, which I think a huge gap that we have as we continue to think about technology as like domestic or international. And like it's one continual ecosystem. And the problem is that a lot of the levers we have for creating incentives around secure by design or for shaping the way that companies are contemplating that competition in this moment are in fact domestic policy. I'm going to say the like bad R word, like regulation. But I think we've done ourselves a disservice because I'm just going to say as someone that studies the geopolitics of tech policy and the geopolitics of technology, the fact that the United States doesn't have a federal privacy standard is a gaping hole in our national security. It's insane. we're also the only country, developed or frankly authoritarian, democratic, name it, that doesn't have one. And that means our companies are building in an environment and a set of incentives that doesn't require them to prioritize privacy and data protection in the same way that they are in other countries. That has an impact on everyone, on every country, every person that interacts with our incredible innovative technologies and companies. So I think to get to that point where we could have a real conversation about how do we want to organize ourselves in our own country around technology, we actually do need to be able to have a foreign policy, national security discussion about those domestic regulatory frameworks and structures, which, if we're all going to be honest, like, not a lot of people have felt comfortable with that for some time. I think we're doing a little bit better there. But even about those structures within government, I don't think our government is particularly well prepared right now to bridge those divides. And so, you know, is that you have people in the White House whose job is to specifically look at the connection between the foreign and domestic? I think TikTok is a really useful case study on where this falls apart, right? That you can have conversations about domestic concerns, and then it's completely divorced from the global conversation on the free, open, secure, and interoperable internet, and the implications of what it means to potentially ban a single company in the context of a single country outside of standards that you can fall back to. Privacy being another example of that. Our data broker industry is pretty scary and large, and most foreign intelligence services, I'm sure, already do walk into our country every day and legally purchase insane amounts of information on every single person in this room, perfectly legally. So I think we have lots of common sense paths that we can go down to bring better coherence into our system in ways that advances innovation and supports the success of our companies. But to do that, I do think that the government has more steps to take, building on some of the really important foundational work that people like Camille have spent the last, I'm not going to say the number of years.
Please don't.
We had, you know, short, just a few number of years doing.
Well, on that point, we are seeing that the U.S.-China rivalry is, you know, driving a lot of our debates around tech policy today. Do you think that is overshadowing other issues in national security and tech?
Yes. I mean, here's the thing. All of us in this community think about the world that we have. I'm not going to be one of these people that wants to talk about policy in some abstraction. There is a reality that you have an extremely well-organized, intentional China that views its success in the world, not just on tech, its success in the world, as predicated on its ability to shape and own an alternative system for technology, and to do that through partnerships with large parts of the rest of the world. And it does that through One Belt, One Road, a bunch of narrative approaches, investments in developing countries, as well as showing up in standard-setting bodies at the United Nations, all sorts of places that used to be left to, pardon me for saying this, but the total nerds of the world, and now are suddenly these domains of fierce geopolitical competition. And they're doing that to advance their own benefits and objectives. It's not that the US approach necessarily needs to be that it's ours or theirs, so much as the reason they're trying to create an alternative version is that we were really successful in building a world order on the concept of universal rights, on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then a technical world that is kind of underpinned by that, but also shared governance between companies, all sorts of different governments, civil society, the idea that no one gets to own it, no one gets to control it. And that's worked really, really well. China wants the internet to be sovereign domains in which states are in charge as a primary order. Those are two very different versions of the world. If you care about human rights, it's kind of obvious why that would be a problem. If you don't care about human rights, you just want to make sure that American business can be successful, it's also a problem. So we have right now some pretty significant grappling happening, let's say. In fact, at the United Nations right now, some really big negotiations on stuff I wish I didn't have to pay attention to. But I say that because I think all of what I just described as being a reason to be concerned about China and technology seems to be absent from a lot of the conversation we're having on competition with China on technology, because we are starting through the premise of where are we in comparison on AI? Where are we in comparison on chips and semiconductors? Where are we on our defense competition? And that again treats every aspect of technology as if it's some sort of silo that doesn't touch the other aspect. And so I think, I'll be a broken record on this, but going back to the ability of the government to consider the sum total of our national interest, not just one conception of national security, is a really important part of the puzzle. I'm not going to pretend that these are easy questions or that there is a simple, easy answer on what our foreign policy, national security policy, and domestic policy should be. But I do think we need to do a better job of considering it, and we risk right now making tech policy through China policy because we're so concerned.
So I'll say that the aspiration, the intention is that, right? If you look at the National Cybersecurity Strategy, it sets an affirmative vision for what our digital ecosystem should look like, how we make the market shifts, and how we underpin a society that moves us in that direction. It contemplates our adversaries, but it is not dictated by our adversaries. That, to me, is the importance of an office like the Office of the National Cyber Director. And when it steps into the fullness of what it can and should be, it contemplates not only the national security implications, the economic security implications, the human security implications. The office is, what, 2.5 years old? There's work to be done.
And
yes?
the new State Department office, all new things.
Exactly, all new things. All of the things that if you look at their mission statements, if you look at the intention behind them, are to do exactly that, to help us do that better, to integrate perspective, to be a convening point, not only internal to the government, but pulling in the private sector partners, the civil society, our international partners to have a holistic conversation. But that does take time. And so I agree with you wholeheartedly that we should be contemplating these things in a broader sense. One of the pillars of my portion of the office, which was focused on future resilience, so all of the things that I talked about earlier, was making sure we had all the right players around the table. That's small businesses, that's our international partners that are in the global south. How are we making sure we have an intentional conversation with them? Not a conversation where they are in the room, but just kind of window dressing. I want a conversation that actually contemplates their needs, educates where need to be educated, and we learn in exchange. There is a lot of innovation happening in other parts of the world, and a societal dynamic that breeds different kinds of innovation and different uses of the technology that we put out into the world. And so, yes to all of that, but I will say I think that government, the U.S. government in particular, is trying to organize itself around that. Now, it is not perfect currently, and will we realize that in its fullness will depend on the people who sign up to go work in the federal government and who hold them accountable from the outside and who make it their business to prioritize those partnerships and that collaboration. But the government is trying.
And Sydney, I want to bring you into this because you mentioned that you were relieved that a lot of this development is happening on American soil. As someone working with these companies day in and day out, do you think that US-based companies view themselves as American companies responsible for advancing these national interests?
I definitely think these companies view themselves as American companies, and I do think in general, and there are some instances where, and I can give a couple examples where like we're working on things and I actually see that unfold. Of course, I think they all, in a lot of cases, can be doing a better job of this. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these companies have platform content policies, right? And so a lot of them will have policies around misinformation or disinformation or hate speech and things like that. We've actually helped a lot of these companies write their very first policies or review these policies. And what they'll do is they'll take generally American values and build them into these policies, right? And so a lot of times when we're operating in another country or when these companies are operating in another country, you do see that tension. And I'm sitting evaluating something and I'm like, this is reminding me that this is an American company because like freedom of speech is like a very American concept, and that platform is just live in that country, and I see why that government's very uncomfortable and upset. And so I do think that like tactically, but also strategically, there are a lot of pieces to like how they do think about it as well. I also think, I'm actually curious from this crowd, like how many people have heard about OpenAI like 5 years ago? We have a few hands in this room. NVIDIA, 5 years ago. Okay. Most Americans obviously hadn't heard of most of those companies, and just for those of you who can't see, we had a few hands raised. NVIDIA is now worth $2.6 trillion, which is it's the third largest company now in the world, and like economically and just like its impact, it's a nation state, and so I think. We just have to be kind of aware of that, and I think that these companies, I don't think they fully can grasp like the influence they have on foreign policy and national security, but I will give like the example of what some of the companies have been doing with Japan, for example. If we're just talking a little bit more about China and kind of countering that. A lot of these companies have been making really large investments. I know that Google, I think in the last month or two, invested $1 billion in a sea cable to increase connectivity with Japan. I know Microsoft invested about $2.9 billion in AI and cloud infrastructure in Japan. And I know that the CEOs of OpenAI, Meta, and NVIDIA have all visited Japan in the last year. And so when you're thinking about like how these companies think about themselves and how we think about them in diplomacy, I think they're very active. They understand these relationships are important, and it ultimately definitely affects our national security.
Can I just, one fun thing on NVIDIA. So Sydney and I were lucky enough to partner on a project last year looking at the future internet and taking the trends of AI, decentralization, and immersive technologies and layering that into the internet and digital infrastructure that we know and asking questions about what does that change about how we think, let's say the tech that people most often interact with will look and be affected by that, and how companies and civil society and industry do or do not know how to address the challenges in that context. And we did a big section on the gaming industry because it's this massively overlooked, unbelievably profitable industry. And I say that because NVIDIA is behemoth it is because it was creating chips for video games. That, like, it literally was spun out of that massive global industry that China has viewed as, and I'm not trying to be the China person again, but has viewed as so strategic that it spent the last decade strategically buying up almost every single major gaming company you can think of. They bought either significant or majority shares in or outright purchased, as well as in the United States and in Europe. And I think people kind of blow that off because the gaming industry still gets treated like it's either the space for children or immature adults or violent video games, when in reality, it's a center of an immense amount of innovation that happens. That leads into the tech stack that we all use and rely on. And I think that's going to happen even more. And so I call that out just because I think it is one of the things that I find most interesting about this space, and really doubling down on what Camille was saying. You really can't totally predict, and certainly as Sydney was opening with, right now in particular, you have all of these different pieces of an industry that aren't used to interacting with each other, combining and bumping into each other in ways that are making certain realities possible that we hadn't contemplated. And so it's not just a question of whether government is keeping up with technology, but whether we're thinking about, as a society, and certainly as a society that believes in democracy, what is it that we want? Like, if I don't know the exact tech that's coming down the pike, what is it that I want as basic rules for what individual rights are? We were talking earlier about, One Medical was purchased by Amazon. Amazon now has a bunch of wearable technology. We don't have answers as to where HIPAA starts and stops and what Amazon might be allowed to use to combine data on biometrics and other information. I don't think that any of us don't want wearables or don't want the ease of One Medical, and I don't think we have to choose good technology or a complete abdication of rights. But that does require us to actually have these conversations about where we think those boundaries are, agnostic to the specific technology, and that's only to get more complicated. I'll stop with my soapbox, but just to go back to the NVIDIA case, AI bursting onto the scene led to this explosion of governance conversations, right? Like the UK, the French, the Americans, the Chinese, everyone has hosted some conference. Every company has had a conversation on AI. Every government has called up every person on the stage to say, what do you want me to do about this? And like, there's no getting away from the foundational questions that we still have failed to answer. You still have to have privacy protections to be able to supercharge innovation on AI. You have to have standards and rules and norms to speed up the ability for companies to operate in predictable environments. This isn't just like a naive tree-hugging position. But we want to have shiny object discussions over and over and over again. And so I think for how we think about this, getting back to basics continues to be one of the most important things that we could do to make sure American industry is successful in the future, to make sure our societies look the way we want them to look, i.e. allow us to continue to have democracy and rights that create the space for innovation that drives forward a better world that we want.
And you've mentioned democracy a lot, and I want to make sure that we get a chance to talk a bit about the 2024 election. There just was big news yesterday about a campaign.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, in addition to that big news, there was the news that OpenAI detected foreign interference on its platforms. The Atlantic Council played a role in detecting that activity. And so I just wanted to ask you, I mean, just where we're at right now, several months out from the election, are the US government agencies and the companies taking the steps they need in order to protect US elections from foreign interference online?
That's a tough question. I think, like the companies, both the US government and many other democratic governments around the world have gotten a lot better and dedicated to understanding these issues and addressing them. At the same time, I think it would be naive to pretend that we don't have a particular subset of our political system actively trying to harass and undermine those people you rely on to make sense of what's happening in the digital world and uncover when Russia, China, Iran, or any other bad actor is seeking to use that information space to undermine our democracy. So on the one hand, I want to applaud the work that's happened. On the other hand, you know, there's a House Weaponization Committee, and if the sound of that gives you chills, there's a good reason. That House Weaponization Committee has launched investigations into every single organization and researcher that you know who has done any credible research at all on the information environment. That has cost millions of dollars for every single one of those nonprofit organizations. Those same entities are seeking right now to prevent the government from coordinating with industry in the ways that we talked about, to make sure that you know when there's a cybersecurity incident and can react, to be able to say when you're seeing certain activity on a platform, or to enable the platforms that frankly have far more information about what's happening on their platforms to raise their hand and wave the flag when something problematic is happening. They've done that through court cases claiming that the United States should not be allowed to talk to companies. They've done that through court cases claiming that companies should not be allowed to moderate content. Make no mistake, those are very well coordinated and intentional strategies to just gum up the works, cost people lots of money, and intimidate people from doing the necessary work of shining a light on understanding our information space. I'm really worried about that. I truly am, and I can say I know a number of people that are not doing the work they were doing before because of this. But I am also deeply encouraged by the people that refuse to stand down. I am also encouraged by the government continuing to try and figure out the ways it can, even in this context, civil servants that have been in government across multiple administrations that are not at all part of the political conversation we're having right now, every single day going in and doing their jobs, and I'm grateful for that. I'm encouraged by the secretaries of state and the state level officials that are working across party lines to figure out what they can do to provide a free, secure election to everyone in this country. And in particular, the people I want to call attention to the extra risk, particularly that women and people of color who operate in this space take every single day to serve as poll watchers, as election officials, as researchers in this space, as candidates, and particularly the risk that they face for doing that in an online space. The strategies that I just described are designed in particular to make it too costly for those people to do that. And we have to give voice to it. So it's not just a question of the US government. It is an active strategy by anti-democratic forces, small d democracy, to try and undermine our democracy from within. And it's on us to make sure that the people we rely on to keep our democracy safe have the protection and support they need to.
Yes.
Sorry, I get angry.
So well said.
And Sydney, how are you seeing the effects of that campaign play out in the industry in Silicon Valley?
I think there's one thing I want to add about elections and something I'm seeing playing out. But I agree with what Rose is saying. I think that working in this space right now is it's under a microscope. It's scrutinized. Everyone feels like the work they're doing is politicized, and in a lot of cases, I just simply don't think it is. I think that a lot of these companies, they literally have policies that aren't political policies. It's just a policy they created that people agreed on, and they're trying to actually enforce those policies. I think one interesting thing just on elections in general, we talked earlier about like the rapid pace of product releases, and and a lot of these product releases and chatbots are putting out misinformation and these things called hallucinations, which are pushing information that's like not quite accurate. And in a funny way, I know that's terrifying. It is terrifying. But in a funny way, I actually think it might change the way that we perceive truth in the internet, and might make people more skeptical and do a little bit more research to get to the right answer. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I know that would have been a lot more useful around the dinner table for me in Michigan over Thanksgiving over the last few years, if people were just, had better conversations about what the truth is and looks like, and are referencing, really solid sources. And so I think that it'll be interesting to see how that plays out with the election this year, and thinking through how we all are just a little bit more skeptical, and maybe it'll calm us down. And I'm a little optimistic that it might actually help with some of the polarization, but very early to say.
Can I just add to that? Only if we are intentional about teaching people how to think critically. There are too many people who won't do exactly what you hope that they will do. They will be mistrustful. They will burrow deeper in the silos and the echo chambers that they find themselves in, and live in that hidey hole, and this will get worse. And so my concern is if we don't back that up with the domestic policy to reinforce the changes necessary in our education system to equip people to understand civics and critical thinking and the other tools that they need, this will only get worse.
And I want to open this up to audience questions in just a couple minutes, but Camille, I wanted to go back to something you said earlier around kind of this unprecedented coordination happening between the private sector and government. What do you think happens to that if Trump is reelected in November?
So, traditionally, on cybersecurity issues, there's been, it's nonpartisan. There's a lot of bipartisan support for a number of the priorities, and the risk landscape, the threat landscape is pretty universal. That said, what we saw in the transition from the Obama administration is that a Trump term one meant that they were just rolling things back for the sake of doing it. And even in a space where there is broad agreement, maybe priorities might shift, maybe you might invest here rather than investing there, but in a place where there is broad agreement, there was a rolling back of policies and a change in trajectory that was worrisome. I think we will see more of the same, right? We didn't even have a top cyber official in the White House. That was one of the catalysts for ONCD's creation and its instantiation in statute, right? And so the concern is that there will be a huge shift in how we think about these issues, and that we might move away from this focus on what are the values that we seek to entrench in the digital ecosystem we see in the future, and moving towards this affirmative vision back to being purely reactionary, or driven by other things, competition by itself, money, all of these things. And so, we should be worried, because a shift in that policy is a shift in everything, because technology underpins everything.
And Sydney, what are you seeing from the industry side on this front? How are the companies preparing for that possibility?
Which possibility?
For a Trump re-election.
Oh, for a Trump re-election. Sorry, I blacked out the Trump re-election possibility. It'll be, I don't know necessarily. I think they're preparing for the election, certainly. I think they're nervous about the election. They're nervous, for the day before, the day of, the day after. I don't know exactly how they will react. I think the challenge with former President Trump is he's just incredibly unpredictable. And so it's not like we know what to expect necessarily. He contradicts himself. He's a little bit all over the place. I think it might make the tech companies' role in American foreign policy much more important for the long term, which is sad. But I think that they'll, be in a lot of ways actually be ones doing some of the diplomacy like in an outsized way compared to if other administrations were in power.
So I just got back. I'm going to sound like a real jerk here. I just got back from Geneva for a major international conference on the future of the internet, and was talking to a bunch of different European governments and actually government leaders from all over the world. And certainly this question came up where every time they would kind of drop their voice and be like, what do you think's going to happen? Like, just as an American, I somehow have the way of knowing, and I don't. But I think there's a few interesting things in terms of how other countries are contemplating this moment, but it also ties to our companies. So one is they definitely, and some of this is, the Russia-Ukraine dynamics, the same conversation is playing out there. I think countries are preparing for, if it is a Donald Trump, being more reliant on their own capacity to address problems. That has certainly resulted in a strengthening of the European alliance and a widening of NATO. That also has impact on tech. So the European Union, over the last few years, put together this massive package of regulations, the Digital Services and Digital Markets Act, that, as imperfect as it is probably the first real serious attempt at democratically aligned tech governance that pulls a lot of these strands we're talking about together. And it's kind of messy in how it gets implemented, i.e. they haven't finished all of the implementing laws that tell companies what exactly it is that they're supposed to do. So we're walking into this crazy election year. I think we came up, 80-something countries around the world are having elections in 2024. More people than literally ever in the history of the world will be voting at the same time that the democratic trend lines are downward in more countries. So that also means that next year we expect to have more new leaders, and particularly new leaders in spaces where democracy is strained. So companies are navigating that mess, which even in the most perfect of moments, I question any company's ability to manage that impossibility. And they're trying to figure out how to comply with this new law that isn't set. The European Union has its elections like now. And so there's a ton of jockeying over understanding foreign influence and foreign interference online in the context of the Digital Services Act. And so it's just a fascinating moment that certainly we can learn a lot for right now. But I think what's interesting about that is we don't have rules for our own companies. So our own companies are right now trying to understand what it is that Europe might do. Europe doesn't understand any of what I just described, the craziness that's happening in targeting the people that do the research that the European Union wants to rely on to understand tech platforms' operations. And so there's definitely an effort to cleave and protect foreign interference as a specific thing to attend to and to ask questions about. And there are people that have an interest in not making foreign interference a nonpartisan space. And so I think that's one to watch in particular for a potential re-election of Donald Trump, that some of what happened before was trying to delegitimize the claims of that foreign interference. And I think you're going to have more countries around the world that are attuned to it and working together and relying on their own resources, as well as their own laws to try and get information or use the power of our tech companies to impact that issue in their own borders. And I worry that that will create really difficult tensions for our companies in directions that none of us like. And it potentially does set up a conflict and conflagration between an American administration and our own companies.
Well, that will keep everyone on the stage very busy for the next few months. I want to open it up now to anyone in the room who might have a question. You can come to these mics. Yes, go ahead.
I don't know how close to, oh, there we are. Hi, I'm Anita. I'm a 2024 security fellow. I write policies at one of those tech companies, primarily in the privacy security space. So a question on regulation, we alluded to this. Why do you think the US doesn't have comprehensive privacy legislation? Do you think CCPA is a good, regional start? When will we get there? Do you think that we don't believe privacy is a human right? That's why we don't have this legislation yet? All of these questions, and would it look like GDPR?
Rose, want to take that?
Sure. Actually, there's a really interesting story behind that. In 2009, was it? So when Barack Obama was elected, he actually had selected someone to come to the White House whose job was supposed to be starting to look at the implications of the commercialization of the tech sector and to have a conversation about what common sense regulation might look like. That person started their job the same day that the Snowden disclosures happened. And so we went from a moment of the American public contemplating the risk of their rights being abrogated by a commercial space to a very necessary conversation on what it is that we expect in terms of how the government might have access to our information and data. And we went through a very necessary process of creating protections so that you would have privacy protections from the government, and then we never went back to the commercial space. And in those years, if we think about what those companies looked like in 2009 as opposed to today, these companies are much larger. They are financial behemoths in and of themselves. They are entwined into the rest of the world, and it's a just much more complicated conversation than it was in 2009. I'm not going to claim that had that timing of things happened, that we would somehow magically have a privacy law. I do think we would have been in a better place to have the conversation that we keep putting off. I don't know whether we will get there. I don't think it's going to happen right now. However, I think when we have the conversation on things like TikTok, it's great, right? Like how many people suddenly were like, I don't like that there's the possibility that a foreign entity can just like have whatever they want on me. The beauty of that is like, you don't like that? You don't like that the Chinese government is capable of having influence operations in your own borders? Welcome to privacy protections. Welcome to transparency rules. May I interest you in caring about tech regulation in the United States? So shortly after the passage of an imperfect TikTok bill, the privacy legislation that had been under debate for many, many years was re-earthed in Congress and now is up for markup. That's not going to pass this time, but they picked up the same bill that they had marked up the last time, and so it gets us closer. I do think that this room of people can be extremely powerful in making the case for privacy protections in this country. And I think some of what has stood in the way of that is people either believing that they don't know enough about tech to have an opinion, which like, please, if you ever have that thought cross your mind, just banish it immediately. And number two, the national security community has not been present. And we sometimes get weaponized to kill a conversation on domestic regulation. I think that we could be leveraged to advance an argument for domestic regulation, particularly when it comes to privacy. So I'm hopeful, but it will require all of us to do something.
Great. And next question.
Hi, my name is Faith Akpato. I'm a security fellow from class of 2019. Thank you so much for this conversation, and I think that it's a perfect follow-up to the previous conversation we're having about the threats to democracy. So in the context of the threats to democracy and the role that tech plays in that space, we've been here before. We've had these kinds of conversations before the last election. We're having it now before the next election. What do you think is most important in the regulatory space and all of the things you've been talking about that we can do so that we're a little further along in this conversation by the next election, beyond 2024?
Take action. One of the things that I've seen is a lot of these collaborative conversations have not landed. We've started to mark up a privacy bill. We have started to talk about, a number of regulations that will impact the tech sector, software liability, all of these things. But none of it has landed yet. And what I don't want to see happen is partisan politics or the next big crisis or all of the things that Rose was just talking about deterring us from making progress in the places that we have started to make progress. And being thoughtful about how we instantiate those things in a way that is not easily rolled back. That is, I think, our best bet to make real progress. The other thing is to continue to educate folks about that root cause piece. We should be building frameworks that address the things we seek to preserve and protect, not legislating and creating regulations based on the tech of the moment. It will change, it will grow, it will do things you never imagined. And so when that happens, what you can't have is a regulation that is only tuned to the instantiation of the past. It must be agile. And we also must be able to recognize when we messed up and do it again. One of the things about tech that I think is admirable when done well is I put it out there, it didn't quite work, so I'm gonna tweak it and we're gonna keep going. We can do that in how we legislate and regulate. We can say, okay, I think this is how we should do it. Ooh, we learned this from tech, that impacted the bottom line in ways we didn't want, and it impacted people's human rights in these ways, and oh shoot, it was weaponized over here in this way. Here's how we tweak it and try it again. And we are really afraid of that. One of the things that has been most frustrating in this moment is the fear of failure has made us not land things. And so we need to be a little less afraid of failure in the regulatory and legislative space.
I just want to say +1 to all of that. The other thing I think that we really need to do, to focus on our own democracy, but also democracies globally, is we need to fix the American news media business model. We need to modernize it, fix it. I don't know the term, but
Super easy.
I think that's going to be really critical for us to fix. I don't think a regulation is going to fix everything.
If you have any ideas, I'm sure our editor-in-chief would like to hear it all.
What do you think, Kat?
I think I'll turn it over to the next question.
Perfect. Aaron Brennan, Truman San Diego. First of all, amazing panel, so thank you all for showing up for us as an organization. My question is, you mentioned U.S. privacy policy and then also security by design, which I think probably comes from policy as well. But I go back to a conversation that was had some years ago about Section 230 and how we basically say you're not responsible if you're a tech company for anything that's on your platform. And so I'm wondering how that ties into privacy, protecting democracy, et cetera, because I think they should be accountable for what's on their platform. Because you had the conversation about, oh, you can't delete something from Twitter because that's censorship, it's the public square. But it's not the public square, it's a tech company's platform. And so, please.
I often say that tech regulation conversations are like a kid's hockey game where like everyone just descends on the puck and then like the puck goes over here and everyone descends on the other puck because we are so desperate for a conversation that we just like run to the one thing anyone is talking about and then have the entirety of the conversation of everything that we are frustrated with about the internet. Unfortunately, I think Section 230 becomes that because it was the first real piece of regulation and legislation that anyone could even focus on. It's interesting. In authoritarian countries, one of the first things they do is actually go to say to companies, anyone says anything on your platform that we don't like, you're liable. And it's the end of the game. So, you know, the liability protection itself was actually a really important innovation. I agree that in and of itself is an insufficient regulation. And so think of it as like push and pull factors. We want these companies to have rights as well. The sorts of things that allow them to, for instance, take content down because that's perfectly within their remit as a private company to make decisions about their platform. That's being challenged at the Supreme Court. I think we would all argue that we think that that should be possible. The flip side of that is I don't want the government to be deciding anything about content. Period. Where do you put that line? Who gets to say that? And I don't want to create a dynamic where companies are so afraid that they're going to be raked over the coals that they don't want to let activists on their platform, that they don't want to let an opposition leader who's running for Congress because they want to try and address corruption or something they don't like to not be allowed on a platform well within the rights of a company to do so simply because they're worried they're going to get sued.
And we have just about a minute left. I don't want to stand between everyone and their Friday plans. So if you want to give us the last question quickly.
All right, I'll try and be quick. Nathan Cole, Security Fellow, new this year, but I'm an investor with a large venture capital fund, so this is an interesting conversation. but I'm fortunate in the sense that I work with businesses that either have a social or environmental mission as their business model. So there's kind of a level of ethics that's like embedded in the culture of that company to begin with. So I have one question, but I think from two sides of a coin. So, Sydney, I guess for a business that doesn't fit that mold, that it's not necessarily in the business of impact, what do you think they could do to, embed a level of kind of like ethics and honesty into their business model from the beginning? And then on the public sector side, how can we also encourage that, but in a way that we're not stifling innovation like, maybe they do in Europe?
Nathan or Nathaniel?
Nathan.
Nathan. I'm so glad you asked. So my company actually just put out a report. If you go to dukeexperts.com, it's right at the top. We did a market research report on the trust and safety industry. It was the first of it. It was groundbreaking, first of its kind on this new emerging industry called trust and safety, where we actually looked at we looked and analyzed and put numbers to like the total addressable market. But another thing that we did is we observed and put together case studies on why having a safe, responsible platform is actually good for the bottom line. And so I actually just I think that these things can and should work together, and our messages to companies is that it will be good for your business to have a safe place and to have a responsible platform. And I think it's actually a very effective message, and I think there's a lot of evidence actually if you dig through, and again, if you want to look at that report just for some ideas, that is the case. And so I really think we need to get away from this like it's either you're going to make money or be responsible. That's just absolutely not true. People want to be where places are friendly and safe, and we've again put some evidence in place to show that.
And I think venture capital is a really great steward of that message and incentives. And one of the things we were doing when I was at ONCD was, evangelizing to venture capital and empowering them to be stewards of having the companies in their portfolio have security requirements, have trust and safety requirements. So there's a lot of work that venture capital can do.
Just to double tap both of those, the trust and safety report came out of that bigger project that I mentioned Sydney and I had worked on. And one of the things that we were really focused on was this kind of interstitial market that people often don't think about that enables companies to do these sorts of things. And so I think as venture capital, also thinking about where are the unseen markets that can be supercharged to enable other industries or other players in the industry to do their job more effectively and at a lower cost towards those objectives. So like no small or medium-sized company that has to do trust and safety functions right now can do that on their own. They're not going to be able to build, meta-style trust and safety teams. So there's a whole bunch of people that are going out there trying to build their own companies to provide those services to those companies so that they can be successful at the next stage. And I think that we sometimes miss the opportunities to invest and supercharge those spaces that have the impact of growing innovation in other industries and for other companies as well.
Well, unfortunately, we're a bit over time, so we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all so much for being on the panel today.
Thank you, Kat.
Thank you, Kat.